The crisis at South Africa's platinum mines continues in the wake of more than 40 people who were killed as a result of a wildcat strike at Lonmin mine at Marikana in the northwest. Several measures have been instituted to restore calm, including the setting up of a commission of inquiry to look into the shootings. Many issues have been identified as factors which fueled the crisis, including that of inter-union rivalry between the National Union of Mine Workers Association and, of course, the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, AMCO. But people are beginning to ask whether the Marikana killings is in fact having an adverse effect on President Jacob Zuma's bid for a second term in office. Today I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Stephen Friedman, who is the Director for the Study of Democracy, to look at whether Marikana is the tipping point that could see President Jacob Zuma lose his bid for a second term in the African National Congress. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me. Many political commentators have suggested that the government's handling of the Marikana crisis is going to be the tipping factor that could possibly unseat President Jacob Zuma. We all know that the ruling party is in a very bitter, divisive leadership battle, which comes to a head at its elective conference in Mangaung. What is your take?
Karima, I think that it's not accurate to say that. I don't see any evidence of that. You know, when media say this, what they're picking up on are people who are already opposed to Jacob Zuma, saying, look, this shows we were right all along. My sense of what's going on in the ANC is what's going on in the country on Marikana is that it's hardening existing positions. So those people who are against Mr. Zuma are saying, you see, we told you all along. Those people who are for Mr. Zuma are saying, but what are you complaining about? What did the government do wrong? So I think that when we read or hear in the media about people within the ANC saying, look, this is bad for Jacob Zuma, if we dig a little bit deeper, we'll probably find out that those were people who were opposed to him in the first place. So I think it's doing far more to harden positions than to shift people against Mr. Zuma.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the ANC leadership battle is an incredibly contested one. And we've seen already since the incident that various individuals have found their way to the center of the drama, so to speak. We've seen the former expelled Youth League president, Julius Malema, trying to use the opportunity to gain mileage, out of the situation, effectively accusing Mr. Zuma of having pulled the trigger and leading to the deaths of all those people. That message was on the front page of every single newspaper in the country, broadcast on all television stations. To what extent do you think what Mr. Malema had to say will resonate amongst the rank and file in the African National Congress, who ultimately will make the decisions about who gets elected in the party?
I don't think it will, because I don't think that Mr. Malema, quite frankly, is in touch with the rank and file. I mean, what he's doing here is a standard case of hearing about something through the media. I don't believe that Mr. Malema had ever been anywhere near the platinum mines before this incident happened, and trying to extract advantage of it. It's a political ploy which has been used by others. It tends to work for a while among the people who you're approaching because they're angry, they're hurt, they feel betrayed. I mean, for heaven's sake, people have lost loved ones. It would be surprising if they didn't feel that way. But on the other hand, it doesn't much resonate beyond that. I mean, we all go on anecdotal evidence or whatever, but certainly in my discussions with people who are active, and I'm not talking about senior politicians, I'm talking about branch members, rank and file people within the ANC, I haven't heard anybody who said, my gosh, Mr. Malema has really opened my eyes to anything. So I don't think that it's actually playing beyond that. In fact, very often, maybe because they're already committed ANC people, the reaction is, this is disgraceful, he behaved badly, he's trying to exploit the grief of people. So I don't think this is helping Julius Malema.
In terms of the actual state of the ANC in the Northwest Province, we know that this province has been particularly plagued by very, very deep, almost intractable divisions. We know several municipalities, for example, were placed under administration because it was so poorly run. Now, generally, in previous incidents, let's say, for example, with the xenophobic outbreaks, we saw ANC rank and file people, filing out across communities, providing support, connecting with poor communities. in the Northwest, particularly in places like Marikana, the ANC is not present. The branch structures of the ANC is not present. Has that got to do with the fact that the leadership, your provincial leadership structures in the Northwest, are so deeply divided that they're unable to connect? Or are there people who actively, are leaving things so that a vacuum can in fact be created and be occupied by populists like Mr. Malema?
No, I don't think we should go for conspiracy theories when there's a simple and neat theory which explains what's going on. We know, as you correctly say, this is a highly factionalized province. We know that when politics gets factionalized, politicians tend to get obsessed with each other and with themselves and tend to ignore voters. And we know that they tend to lose touch with the grassroots of society. And I'm afraid that's what's happened at Northwest. There are finally media reports which we should have had a week ago, talking about the kind of conditions that people are living in the Marikana area. Yes, there's a certain responsibility by the mines which we must take seriously, but on the other hand, it is legitimate to say that if people are living in these dreadful conditions with sewage running down the streets, it's because government is not doing what it should do. And government isn't doing what it should do because it's too busy fighting among itself. So I'm afraid that some of these chickens are coming home to roost. We are seeing not throughout the country, but we are seeing in certain parts of the country what happens when provincial leadership or local leadership become so obsessed with their factional battles that they really don't have time to deal with the people who voted for them.
Now, the issue of politicians seizing the opportunity, what I find particularly interesting was the presence of the UDM leader, Mr. Bantu Holomisa. Now, of course, many people will argue that a lot of the miners, or mine workers rather, that were killed are from the Eastern Cape. But I can't recall having ever seen Bantu Holomisa at the site of other killings, like, for example, at Impala, for example. Why was Mr. Holomisa there, do you think? What was in it for him politically? Are the tribal underpinnings that, the mainstream media is not picking up on? I found it astounding that out of all the opposition leaders, he was the one that was actually given a platform.
Well, it's not that astounding. Mr. Holomisa is actually a very regional politician. It's not only that he's an Eastern Cape politician, he is actually, at one stage, he was dislodged, but at one stage his party was running the Mthatha municipality. He happens to be very strong in that area around Mthatha, which is part of the OR Tambo region of the ANC, where the Marikana miners come from. So what he is doing is doing what any regional politician would do. No, you could argue that he should have been there a long time ago because these are people who may well have voted for him and that he'd have to answer to. But the fact that he's there at this particular event is not surprising. A colleague of mine some years ago did a study at a research center I was at and actually found that you could actually trace the UDM vote to where people from Mr. Holomisa's home region were on the mines. That's where he gets a lot of his votes from. So the fact that he's there, the fact that he was welcomed there is not particularly surprising. It obviously has no implications beyond that because it simply confirms his role as a regional politician.
He was watering all his roots, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of the ANC Youth League, it finds itself in a really interesting position. We have this, amorphous friends of the Youth League that are in fact ANC people that have gathered outside of the structures in a way to circumvent the mother body and potential disciplinary action, who's been providing the kind of support and infrastructure around Mr. Malema. To your mind, Stephen, what is the space within the ANC for people who are aligned to the Friends of Julius Malema, or rather the Friends of the Youth League, to provide him with a kind of political cover in the aftermath of an event like this? How is that kind of thing likely to play itself out in the African National Congress?
Karima, I remain convinced that Julius Malema is not actually at the center of all of this. He's not actually somebody who makes things happen. He's somebody who is useful to other people. And the people he's useful to are leaders of the ANC, who we can call the nationalist faction, people who are very concerned about increased black role in the professions and in business. It is useful to them to have Malema out there making a noise. The bottom line for them is that unless they control the ANC Youth League, they are weakened. So at the moment, part of the action is the fact that they control the Youth League at the moment. It's their executive, it's their people. But in a sense, they're paralyzed because the Youth League current leadership has been weakened by this. There's a bit of a vacuum. There's an alternative leadership which is not part of the faction, but they can't do anything unless there's a special conference. So really what we're seeing at the moment is a bit of a vacuum there in which there's a stalemate between two opposing factions. Malema was the public face of the one faction, but he now has to do that from the stands rather than on the field, I suppose.
Now, the standoff between the Youth League and the ANC around Mr. Malema is well known. But last week's comments that he made at the funeral, where he didn't just attack Mr. Zuma, but in fact asked workers to join an opposing union than the ANC's ally, the National Union of Mine Workers, effectively threatening the tripartite alliance. How does that kind of rhetoric on the part of Mr. Malema win him friends in the ANC, even among those who are opposed to Mr. Zuma? Because presumably, even hypothetically, if Mr. Zuma were to be defeated in Mangaung, that alliance will continue beyond Mr. Zuma leading the African National Congress. How does one reconcile, or rather ANC people who've been quietly backing Mr. Malema, how do they reconcile his rhetoric with the fact that they would actually have to lead the organization, after the leadership battle is concluded in December, in the event that Mr. Zuma loses? Well,
the cynical view, which may well be the accurate view, is they don't have to reconcile it because he's useful to them and they don't much care how he ends up. And I think that's very much part of the reality. In Mr. Malema's mind, I'm sure that what is going on here is quite clearly, given what he said at the memorial service, etc. I mean, his only option now, all he's relying on is that an anti-Zuma faction wins and that's his way back into the ANC. What, of course, he's doing is creating a situation, as you're suggesting, that even if that faction wins, it's going to be very difficult for them to let him back into the ANC. The ANC still has certain traditions, certain customs, certain way of doing things. Quite frankly, hurling abuse at several cabinet ministers and an alliance partner at a memorial service is not part of that. But that may well serve the purpose of the nationalist politicians. It creates a certain amount of pressure on Mr. Zuma. It creates a certain amount of momentum for their campaign. They would hope that it'll get them elected. If after it gets them elected, it doesn't do any good for Mr. Malema, that's not their problem, that's his problem.